Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study through the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We're currently in Genesis chapter 3, and we have now come to the sad, result of Adam's sin. He was told by God, he was commanded by God not to eat from the tree. And he said, on the day that you eat from the tree, you will surely die. And as we see in this chapter, he ate from the tree. And he did not die physically, but he died spiritually, meaning he was separated, alienated from the life of God. Now, we also see in God's pronouncements, God's judgment of man's sin that he pronounced on the serpent, which, as if you remember, I said the serpent, he did not ask why he did what he did. Interesting. But he pronounced judgment on the serpent that he would crawl on his belly. So the snake that we see today that crawls like a reptile, that was a curse by God. And then Eve would bear children in pain. That's interesting, right? That women, I believe, are the only creatures, and I may be wrong on this, but I believe that women are the only creatures that bear children in the hard labor. And then Adam was to work the brow. He used to work the ground, labor, until his death. We also see then the pronouncement. Let's look at some of these verses here. I want to go back because there's some of this here of God's pronouncement here, because it's a very interesting. That Adam, we now have to labor for this. I wanted to look at verse number 19. He said, "You will eat bread by the sweat of your brow until you return to the ground, since you were taken from it, for you are dust, and you will return to dust." Now, interesting, God says this, you are dust, right? When Adam, remember when God formed man's body from the dust, he breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. Now, breath, the use of the term breath there is synonymous to spirit, breath, spirit, not air, although you can probably for sure say that happened, that man began to breathe air. But what the God bringing to life man, it was his spirit. So it is interesting here that God refers to man as just dust. Now, again, I'm kind of looking at this with thoughts here of what is God seeing here? In other words, no longer is there a spiritual connection, but that to God, Adam's spirit is there, but it is alienated from God's life. And so now man is reduced to his physical nature. Now that's going to be important as we move on to understand man is just. When we say man is the sinner, because he is reduced to just his nature. We say man lives by his lower nature. We wrestle with that today, right? we still sin today. And the reason why we sin is because we're wrestling with the what? The carnal nature, our flesh nature. Now, what is that nature? See, remember our spirit and soul. And at this point, let me kind of go back because this is important here that God is making this proclamation here too. Remember that when God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, man was a living soul, a complete being. You also will note that his spirit, his soul, and his body were all living and living unto God. Man through his spirit contacts God and the realm of God. Man through his body, his 5 physical senses, he contacts the world around him. Through his 5 physical senses, his eyes, his ears, his touch, his taste, and his smell, he contacts the physical world. Now, before the fall, all of that came through the spiritual side. Adam enjoyed spiritual relationship with God. So that his soul, which is his mind, his intellect, his will, his desires, were all controlled through and by the spirit in which he was connected to God. Now we have God pronouncing, "You're just dust." Why? Because his spirit is dead, meaning cut off from the life of God. Adam no longer receives light from God. He no longer receives that light and love from God. Now this is important here because it kind of helps us to understand why, for example, reform fails, why just going to church fails, why just saying I'm going to try to do the best I can fails. At this point, man is already a failure. He's cut off from God. Adam is feeling that pain. He's cut off from God. He's alienated from God. His spirit no longer receives life. His spirit no longer receives that communication, that fellowship from God. Man begins to live through his senses, right? Man begins to live through his senses. Let me go back and let's take a look here. We see this, now watch this back in verse number 7. Well, look at verse 6. Then the woman saw that the tree was good for the food and delightful to look at, and that it was desirable, obtaining wisdom. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. And the eyes, now get this, now watch this, see, the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made lion cloths for themselves. In other words, right at this point, this is the spiritual death. The spiritual death of Adam and Eve. Their eyes, no, get this, their eyes were open. Now remember, when God created them, they were naked and didn't know it. They weren't ashamed. Now, the eyes of them were open. But why? They're living by their 5 physical senses. Okay? They're living by their 5 physical senses. So now God pronounced, he pronounced this judgment right, on Adam. And he says, now get this, you are dust, and you will return to dust. You will labor and hard labor until you return to the dust. So at this point, man is living by his sinful nature. Man is living by um, um, and I guess yes, we're going to see this throughout. But man now lives by his spirit. That what he receives now, he does not receive from God as he once did, as he lived in that. See, as he lived in that presence of God, which provided life, love, light. He now, because he is cut off, he is alienated from the life of God, he now begins to live by his 5 physical senses. They begin to dominate him. Now, why is this important to understand? This is important to understand because this is why sinners sin. We sin because we do not have a relationship with God. Sinners sin because there is nothing in their spirits connected to God. So now my mind, my emotions, my desires, right, dominates my will because and through the 5 physical senses. So why don't we see God? Because we're alienated from him. We don't see God. We don't feel God. We don't, right, realize God. And the reason why is because our spiritual natures are cut off from him. Our spiritual natures are cut off. We don't see God. Now, so there's a couple of things I think I want to advance here because I think it's important. There's a couple of things here that's important to understand. Why man sins. See, that when we say that man is hopelessly lost in his sin nature, because remember his spirit is alienated from God's life. His spirit is cut off from God's life. Okay, that's important to understand. Adam, this would make, and by the way, and this would make Adam's sin so grotesque. Because he sinned in the light of God, enjoying the fellowship of God. We're enemies of God by nature. Scriptures tells us that over and over. We're enemies of God. Enemies. We cannot help but to sin. This is where it starts, right here. This is where it starts. Now understand this. Adam, who lived in the life of God, the Spirit of God, the love of God, the light of God, what makes his sin so grotesque was that, and again, the why is the most baffling questions I have about this. Like, why Adam? Why did you sin? Well, so it's because he was in that life. right? He didn't have to. He didn't have to sin. He could have lived on. And as a result of it, guess what? He now knows good and evil. He now knows what God meant. Now remember we talked about when God says, don't eat of the tree, you will know good and evil, right? You don't eat of it. Well, he knows that. We said that word know now means to experience. Adam, has experienced spiritual death. He knew what was good, and now he knows what is evil. So at this, the Bible doesn't get into, of course, what Adam felt and what he thought, right? He just doesn't get into it. But don't you wonder, at this point, well, what are you thinking, Adam? That at this point, you know, he had to be like, okay, I know what good is. Evil is worse. And I wish I didn't go down this road. And at this point, of course, he hasn't even begun. He's just going to begin. Right? He's just going to begin. The hard labor pains. He's just going to begin that. But right now we see is that Adam he feels that and again, so now from this moment on, he begins to live his life apart from the life of God. Apart from the life of God. Adam now is a sinner. Meaning he is apart from God. He is existing, but he is now existing apart from God. Now, obviously, I'm going to pick this up. I'll pick this up in because there's a couple other things I want to talk about. The sin nature of man. How the sin nature works. All right, guys. I will see you in the next study. See you next time.